This is your assignment. And go.
Yay.
I'm just kidding. So this is called Topographic Aperture. The idea really comes from the concept that you can actually read two-dimensional information in a semi-three-dimensional way. So that's why I started with topographic, and the fact that we're dealing with density of patterns is where I brought in the aperturistic side of things. So when you look at a topo map, right, this is kind of what you're used to seeing. By now in your studies, all of you have seen this before, right? Yeah. Yeah. So you can tell by just reading a topo map, wherever the areas are dense, there's a certain degree of slope that differs from areas that are obviously more sparse or less dense. And then you can read other, characteristic information with hatch patterns, showing water or different types of landscape. But what we're going to try to do is emulate the communication of secondary systems with an otherwise patternistic approach, right? So when I jump back to the assignment, what you see is what I like to think is a fairly dynamic pattern. The key here is that you don't read one thing in every location, and every location does have a focus, but it also has some element of all the other systems that are built into it. So the description is incredibly simple, and I think that you guys are going to find this to be a good introduction to a design exercise because it's not super technically challenging. It's giving you an opportunity to think of a very, very simple concept and apply it without the difficulties of really crazy algorithmic programming. So these are your requirements down here. Your objective is to calibrate systems, and calibrating is really important, to communicate patterning through solidity and porosity. Utilize layering of systems to generate a distinct pattern recognition conditions throughout your site. Okay, so the key there is calibration and patterning. So you're going to need a total of 3 layers. That's 3 separate algorithmic systems that are basically coincident, right? And this, you're not actually warping a surface. They're not going to be literally above or below one another. They all just need to be, meshed out to be black, and you're supposed to be able to read in different areas each of the 3 systems distinctly, but they shouldn't be alone in that area. So I'd like you to set your site to 100 feet by 100 feet, and make sure that when you're going through this exercise that you can actually see each of the systems. And what I mean by that is I have 3 primary systems. One is made up of squares, the other is made up of triangles, the other one is made up of circles. So in this corner, in the top right corner, the circles are the dominant pattern. In the bottom left corner, the triangles are the dominant pattern. And across the center of this, the squares are the dominant pattern. And you can see what that pattern is too. I can see that this circle pattern is a full radius circle across the top, and it's a very thin radius or small radius circle at the bottom. So that's a direct linear gradient going across that pattern. My square pattern is centralized across 3 points, one in the bottom right corner, one kind of near the center, and one in the top left corner. So that's going to be, that was an attractor point system. And the other one is the triangulation system, which is, it's essentially a grid system where I pulled one of the triangle pieces. I just kind of yanked it to make it a smaller triangle in terms of its height. So I brought the top point closer to the hypotenuse of the triangle. Okay? Not too much to think about. What I would like you to do is think about it first, rather than just jumping directly into Grasshopper and worrying about where's this tool, where's that tool. My suggestion to you is sit down and sketch out a few of the potential patterns you think you can make. Okay, so that means actually sit there and say, like, I can make a circle pattern, and I'm going to do them all this radius up here, and it's going to reduce to be a small radius here, or something like that. Okay, and just give yourself a rule set to work toward. Otherwise, you're going to get lost. Additionally, I'm okay with you using one of my patterns. You may not use any more than one of my patterns. And I mean that like explicitly, one of my patterns. What questions do you have?
Will you be there to hold our hand?
Yes. So think of it this way. You know how like in design class you have desk crit days? Well, this is kind of like a desk crit day in a way, where I'm going to be floating, and not necessarily like I'm meeting with each one of you, but I'll be floating around the room, helping you out. So there will be very few tutorials, but if I find that, you know, a handful of you are having trouble with a particular concept, I'll jump up here and do either a refresher or a new tutorial on something you might be missing. What other questions do you have? None?
So when you say pattern, you mean like, you know how you have like a gradient, kind of like big circles going to small? Is that what you mean by a pattern?
Mm-hmm.
And so then,
A pattern in this case, I think, is anything that's built off of an algorithmic system. So these are all grids. Yours might not necessarily be a grid per se, but I would say stick with something that's kind of panelized, a little bit repetitive, that has a logical system behind it. Does that make sense? Yeah, kind of. All right, yeah.
So I could say I could put all the squares in one corner and then the triangles in another one and then the circles on both ends, and that would be a different pattern.
Yes. I would hope that you'd try to make it in terms of the minimum requirements, yes, that would absolutely do it. But I would hope that you would try to make it a little bit more interesting, because what's going to happen is it's going to just look like a technical exercise. So what you see here is that these patterns are, and that's the calibration side of it, these patterns are calibrated so that no particular pattern is smacking you in the face and saying, this is my pattern right here, you know?
Okay.
They're kind of blended together, and I've taken my domain, right? You guys are familiar with what I mean by that at this stage. I've taken my domain for each of these patterns, and I've kind of squashed the minimum and maximum values as closely together as I possibly can, where I can still see systems in certain areas, but I don't get a sense that any of the systems are alone. Does that make sense? So think of it as a combination, like what you're designing is a little bit about the logic, and it's a lot of bit about the graphic, you know, sort of textile that you're developing. What other questions? Okay, so I slated 2 whole days to work on this project. I'm going to gauge at the end of today how you guys are doing to see whether or not we're going to get more actual class time on this, or if I'm going to truncate that down to, you know, maybe we just do like a couple of supplementary ones next time, and then we'll continue on with other tutorials next week. But let's see how you're doing by the end of today. Okay? You all look a little flabbergasted.
Yeah.
What is so intimidating about this to you?
So it's like 3 different design systems, but design systems being algorithm and new creation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's just 3 layered patterns.
They're flying down the same thing. So
Yeah.
it's like, so if anything, it's like 3 different art pieces mixed into one.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, that's what I see.
Anyone have major concerns?
Sounds easy.
Your faces don't seem excited about this.
I'm thinking right now, like,
No worries.
thinking patterns, what patterns can I do? What have we done?
All right. Well, Justin's excited. So.
He's always.
All right. Cool. So I'm gonna be I guess for the first half an hour or so, I'd say start thinking, just don't get too much into the grasshopper. Think about what systems you kind of know how to build, and just consider what might be an interesting thing to overlay with one another. Okay? And then, maybe about a half an hour in, you guys can jump into trying it out. Let's do it.